Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming to hear about some of the works that I've made leading up to the current works now on view in the second floor. I wanted to talk about some of the beginning questions that I've had that led up to, of course, the questions that are raised in the works here. Generally, my main interest is how collections get made and how they're essentially influenced by contemporary motivations that are made not necessarily in relationship to the historical past, but more reveal contemporary concerns, whether it's through conservation methods or registration forms, and how people basically like make a taxonomy or organize historical materials, or even up to the way that the material is displayed in a gallery. I think that in a sense it was like through making the artworks I wanted to not necessarily have an answer specifically, but more have a broader understanding of not just the historical material, the story that we might understand of a past that we don't live in, but how those materials also function in contemporary life as well. So we will begin now. I wanted to start with this project, which was made at the Hammer Museum in 2016. It was one of the first times that I had worked with a collection so closely, and the general question was about how history in an institution gets made when there's not enough information. And so I was thinking like, oh, well, there in many museums and in archaeology, etc., we have all of these fragments, historical fragments that we actually might not know what they are. And so how do people in institutions actually write and reconcile the lack of information that is available? And so working with the Fowler Museum, which is the ethnographic museum, cousins with the Hammer, which is the contemporary museum, I went through I did a site visit just to their storage, and so they had this shelf in the curator office that had all of these objects that had lost their cataloging number. And so in a sense, nobody knew exactly what they were, but all they knew was that at some point they were entered into that collection for a reason. And so along with the fragments, there was all of these post-edit, the original version, be like, maybe that was not wrong. That was wrong because now we know more information, so now we can sort of guesstimate this new version. And so onward with the different generations of post-its, you actually see a very short timeline of the processes of history that actually happened throughout centuries as well, no? And so I actually picked some of these objects to reconstruct based on these notes. And so, for example, there was this, in the blue is the actual artifacts that they have, and they had a note that it said that these objects belong to a ceramic. And so the collections manager actually told me that there was a collector who had a ceramic in his house, and he put all of these little trash bits inside of the ceramic and then donated it together to the museum. And so when they got accessioned, both of them became a singular object, like ceramic and the things inside. And years after, the ceramic got lost. And so, or they got separated, but then this bag full of these like little trash things said that it belongs to a ceramic. And so, of course, people are like, but it's not a ceramic. But in a sense, the catalog says it's a ceramic, so how can it actually exist as that? And so I actually made these reconstructions of the object as a single potential form that it might have been based on those notes. And so the ceramic is a ceramic that contains the actual shapes of these trash little bits, and then the drawing is a record of them being together, of how it could have existed together. So you can see that even the white thing is like the thing in the shirt collar that keeps your collar straight, and so it now is a ceramic. And so in a sense, I was thinking like, oh, in a way, many of these like small cataloging registration issues over time make very big impact on the way that we might understand history. One of my favorite ones is these two rocks. And so it has a post-it here that says, 2 rocks found on shelf, doorstops, ? And so I think what happened was that the rocks were used as the office doorstop, and someone picked it up and put it in the shelf of the artifacts. And just by doing that, it became an antiquity. And so it was just in this like small gestures of like, now these stones that maybe was just like holding the door now is an antiquity and cannot ever leave the museum because now they have a conservation and they're climate controlled and all of these things. And just for this small note, I made a reconstruction of how it could actually be a doorstop, a single version. And so, yeah, so I think that alongside these works, I also was very interested in undeciphered languages and how can we actually access information, again, that we don't know about in a new way. And so I made a series, I'm still making the series of drawing actually that is based on the Rango language, which is undeciphered yet. And the way that these drawings are made is that the original artifact is drawn and I have cut out all of the text and then rearranged them in a different or arbitrary new way. And so for example, this is like, so it's like alien, human, animal, plant. And so this one is actually a formal one, so it's by counting the number of strokes. This one is again by number of strokes and it's round to straight marks. You know, it doesn't actually even have to make sense because they can be holding hands, or most animate to inanimate. And so it's just a temporary reorganization of this text until we might be able to actually understand what it could have been. This is like living and non-living. And so in a way, it's like, how would you even know if that's a living object? But to some degree, it's like we don't actually have to organize or catalog things in a logical way for them to make sense. Zodiac signs, triplets, things that might be related. And so, you know, I think that I wanted to work with this because there's 24 actual surviving objects. And so I'm like, okay, eventually I will do, you know, the exercise with all of the objects. And so I've done them continuously for a long time. This is friends, frenemies, and enemies. Or it could be friends and frenemies and enemies, depending on how you might perceive yourself. And so at the time I was actually, you know, reading about this 𝘗𝘳𝘳𝘳𝘬 and how it made like images of these specific collections. And so I actually wanted to use the format and began making this collection drawings. And so the first series works that I made, West Mexico ceramic collection at LACMA. And so what I wanted to do was trace how the ceramics in the single West Mexico ceramic collection had been now, because they came from 3 different states, but now they exist as a singular West Mexico ceramic. And so what the project ended up being was these 3, you know, this one is from Colima, this one is from Nayarit, and then this one is from Jalisco. And so when you go to the museum, they actually exist as a singular West Mexico collection when, if you separate them, you can actually begin to see actual formal differences in the way that they might have existed in the past. And so, again, it was just more thinking about the contemporary categorization and what information gets made, what information gets lost in a way. And so after making this project, I was like, oh, maybe the 𝘗𝘳𝘳𝘳𝘳, you know, index format, I might be able to use the same sort of formatting to think about other questions about cataloging and collections itself. And so I actually just begun making these like, maybe, because I was like, maybe I can have my side curatorial shows in as drawings. And so I made up these like versions that were my own interest. You know, this is 13 international dogs that actually, I think this drawing ended up at the Brooklyn Museum and the curator fact-checked all of the dogs, and then this is a cat that ended up becoming part of the dog collection. And so in a sense it was just like, well, maybe this cat was a dog for me and now it can be both dog and cat. And so in a sense it was just like thinking about these subtle, I'm like, it definitely looks like a dog. And so when you apply those like formal small slips that change the collection into like broader cultural things, it really makes a big difference. Here's ones that I made that were actually collections of functional objects. So these are 18 funerary objects from different parts of the world. And then here there's 19 mnemonic objects. And so I actually was thinking like, oh, maybe these works are all meant to still do a function that might not be able to do because now they're in out of the like cemetery grave. Now they're in a collection. And so, again, if I have made other projects that are about, afterlife and then the contemporary situation that many of these funerary objects are in when they're in a museum and not in a grave, and the conflict and compromises that can be done with them. But as I was thinking through those processes, that's when these sort of other works were made. This is my own wish list. And so here I was stuck in a shaman and magic afterlife thing when I was making the work for the Gwangju Biennial by understanding how to contact the afterlife. And so I was, through researching all of these different methodologies, I actually, collected so many different ways that ended up in my desktop. And then I made these sort of drawings to organize my own thoughts. But then actually one of the main interests that I had was how contemporary impulses of institutions are also its own category. And so I started making this 11 broken and some restored artifacts. And so this is essentially works that have really nothing to do with each other in their original historical form, but now because they have been restored and broken, it's something that happened in more contemporary life, and this is sort of how they're reorganized. This is 14 deaccessioned artifacts. I also was reading a lot and understanding about deaccessioning and accessioning policies, like basically how things get collected or who decides when things leave. And so I thought about this drawing as sort of a therapy session by the objects that were we were all part of our collection and very important at some point, but now we're all deaccessioned, and then we have our little therapy together session to, tell our own trajectory and stories. Even though we came from so many different places, now someone has let us go. And then here's 20 looted and some repatriated artifacts. I think that these were similar style to this therapy session, that it's I was thinking many of the contemporary lives that these objects accumulate are almost overshadowing their historical original function, because some of the things that have happened onward is actually, to me, more interesting than what a hypothetical past that we might not know is. And so here I want to those were just sort of to explain the trajectory of thought and how that specific format has really helped me organize all of these thoughts. But I wanted to show a specific concise project that I did that really reflect the, conservation and registration and display things that I was talking about, and how sometimes some of those contemporary needs might come into conflict with an original function. And so I actually spent a year and a half researching this cenote. This is the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. It's in current day Mexico, but it is actually the donation. A cenote is a naturally occurring water pit. It's limestone, and the rain carves the rock, and so it was actually used by the ancient Maya as a donation pit for the Mayan rain god. And so they used to throw a lot of votive offerings, which included living people lit on fire. And so people used to be put on fire and then put in the pit. And so I went to spend a year at the Harvard Peabody reading about all of the documentation back and forth between the man Edward Thompson, who was dredging the cenote, and the director of the Peabody at the time in the 1900s, understanding how did this material from this pit went from the water into the collection now at the Peabody. So originally I thought that I would make a legal work that was just following the legal loopholes that allowed for this material to leave the cenote and ended up in the storage, because I had heard that, Mexico has this law that the country owns all of the antiquities of the country. And so I was then how was he able to dredge? And so in a sense, they have separated the man-made monuments from the naturally occurring monuments. And so because there's in Chichen Itza, there are man-made pyramids that are not open because they're preserved. They can't be open because they're cultural heritage, but because the cenote was naturally occurring, he was able to dredge it. And so I was thinking like, oh, these like contemporary law allowed for even probably a more sacred site to be excavated and then not pyramid, no? And so, but as I was reading all of these letters, it actually became a conservation work, because in the letters, man, Edward Thompson starts freaking out because as soon as he starts taking those objects from the water, they start falling apart. And so they had actually been better preserved because they had been submerged for a century in the water. And as soon as they're touching air and drying, they start falling apart. And so the director is teaching him light conservation notes. And actually here we can see this is one of the objects that was taken out. And so what this actually is 1 billion plus particles of burnt fabric being held together by glue, because he's teaching the person how to, you know, remember how I said that there was like people lit on fire when they were donated, and so it's all of their clothes were also burnt, but it was preserved in the shape of a fabric because they hadn't been touched since they were burnt. And so, of course, when they get dry and start touching, all of the carbon starts falling apart. And so, so Thompson is actually conservators had actually put glue to hold all of these particles together in the shape of a fabric that is actually didn't exist at the time anymore. And so what the museum actually currently has is the shape of a X fabric but it's actually so many particles of this burnt carbon, no? And so what I wanted to make this project about was how, the rain god, even though I'm not it's not that I know if the rain god exists or not, I know that an ancient Maya 100% knew that rain god existed for them. And so what does it mean for this material that is supposed to be submerged, for their relationship with their deity to be now in the driest spot in storage of a museum, because now their job is to keep it very, very dry and climate controlled. So then I actually, made a cataloging drawing just to understand how they exist. And actually, as I was thinking through these drawings, even after, when these drawings actually entered a collection, I realized that they're actually drawings and also a very shallow sculpture, because this is also, 1 billion particles of carbon in the shape of a drawing that is like slightly off of the paper. And so in a sense, it's a sculpture that is made to mimic this original one, no? So you can see here, and then here we have that's the same one, kind of. And so I actually was thinking about even the future of my own work as a sculptor, because, when they enter a collection, there was a interview with a conservator that was like, what do you want us to do if something happens to these drawings? And so I suggested that in the future, a future conservator can actually redraw these works from the beginning, because then it will sort of complete the cycle of ancient conservator making a shape of this fabric in the past, and also a future conservator doing exactly the same thing by making the drawing. But we will see. That's a 1.5 work. But I think that through the process of drawing them, you really get to understand the subtle nuances of things that you might not be able to see in a written out catalog thing, because many of the Excel, TMS or different institutional catalogs is really, name, title, dimension, material. But when you actually spend the time looking at them, you see, again, all of these nuanced things. So for example, if you can see all of these carbon particles, someone has subdivided them and made this is one set, this is another set. And I was thinking what happens when one of these actually breaks and makes two? Do they have to make a new cataloging number, or do each one of the particles need to have its own independent accession number, because it's not a single object anymore? And so I think that my interest generally is also in the existing institutional methodologies. There's a practical limit to what you can actually do, but when you go into the particle level, what is actually the smallest fragment of an object? It could be if you can actually see it, then you're well, that's a fragment. But if you can't begin to see it, how does the logic of the practical parts of policy accommodate for these other impractical parts, which are very existing, which really do exist, I mean. Here's all of them. And so, yeah, I was thinking like this is a whole sculpture. And so the installation part of the project, which was more about the conservation and actually involving the institution in the production of the institution actually became part of the work as well, because I wanted to make an installation where the institution itself would have to come up with a way to make a reunion between the rain god and its material, because in theory, they are the ones keeping those two things apart. And so during COVID, I actually collected dust from the storage of where these works are stored. And so I'm thinking like, okay, well, these objects are shedding tiny particles, and if I collect the dust, it will actually contain the actual material in the collection. And so, so the installation is actually a copal, which is a tree sap, which was one of the main materials that was dredged from the cenote, which is also a glue and a binder. And so I was thinking, this work is just direction. So the museum gets a direction that says, here's some dust from the storage, is the actual object that is supposed to be a donation to the rain god, and explaining the whole thing. And they have to make a copal structure that binds those particles together, and then make up a new way of putting rainwater onto here. And so they will make a reunion in different ways. And so this one was a very funny one. This is at Sao Paulo Biennial, they made a Hans Haacke, and then they put the copal inside because they're like, well, we made a Hans Haacke years ago, so we can just make a new one and then insert the other work in there. And so it's constantly getting wet. This one was This one was in New York, and so they made this copal block, and then in the ceiling it was a brand new building, and they made a hole in the ceiling to make it look like it was leaking. And so even in the opening, people were like, oh my God, the rain is getting in the artwork. And then they were trying to like do that. This one was a very special installation because it was actually at the Radcliffe Institute gallery, which is at Harvard. And so the actual conservator, whose job is to keep those two things apart, came. And she was actually really moved when she had to put water on this sculpture, because her day-to-day job is to really keep that thing dry. And so I think that different circumstances of the same shape. This one was also installed in Mexico, and so in a sense it was a different, I think they did a audience participation where people could come and re-water the thing. Same here. And this is currently actually on view at MMCA, where they made what is this called? Yes, it's like a humidifier. And so it has two humidifiers inside, and it's always raining in there. And so the works actually come with this letter to the museum to like explain the projects. But in a sense, the letters are the result of many emails that have happened before, but it's a way for the public to understand all of these conversations that that have happened. And so alongside with this, of course, there's always a cataloging of exactly what the catalog says because as you draw them, it reflects so many of the, again, circumstances of contemporary life. So for example, here you see this like jaguar eating a monkey or something, and this is actually a Peruvian ceramic that got photographed next to a Mexican ceramic. And so just by the photograph, it sort of became, like a stowaway of the collection, and it entered sideways. And so now they're together. Here's another. And again, it's the same question about somebody has decided to put these things together now, even though originally they were not together, just because they're formally similar. And so now they exist as a single object instead of, different ones that might have been separate originally. Here is a really interesting, these gold discs have this beautiful etching on them, but then, ancient Maya used to crush the discs and then throw them in the water, but now a conservator has made it really flat so we can see the etching, even though originally it was a ball. This one is 3 different forms of conserving ceramics from 3 different generations of and methodologies of conservation. So in conservation before, used to be all these fragments used to be put together, and then they would finish the vase and paint it to kind of pretend looking like a whole. And then they stopped doing that because they're like, oh, maybe the public should be able to see the parts that are different. And so they're put together and refilled, but not painting it to make it look like an original. But now currently the conservation is basically just stabilizing the work, so it's not actually glued together at all. And so in a sense, these 3 different objects that in the past probably existed at the same time, now formally they're like 3 completely different shapes. What I like about this one is that probably a registrar received a box with 1,000 beads, and now they have to catalog all of them. So for conservation, they strung it into a necklace just practically to keep them together. And so now they exist as a single necklace instead of separate 100 beads. Oh, so these are just the bolts that the copal came in. And so I think that the drawing process, because it's so slow, it actually really helps to show so many of these smaller nuanced like things that happen over time. And so I actually, Peabody has the majority of the collection, but then I started reading onward how they had moved some of the objects, and I was interested in actually following the trajectory of that material that started in a single place and then traveled because of different circumstances. So at some point, the Peabody sent the Field Museum 27 little bells, and I don't know why, but now there are 27 little bells over there. And then in the 60s, Mexico sued to get their objects back. And so the Peabody did not return them. They traded some of the objects, but they returned only gold and jade objects. So now the works that are in Mexico are actually just gold and jade objects. And so the gold objects actually stayed in Mexico City, and the jade objects went to another region. And so in a sense, if I'm a public looking at and learning about Chichen Itza for the first time in this museum, and I only see jade objects, I can imagine that primarily jade was donated to the Mayan rain god, when in fact it was a broader picture. And so this is one of the works that I actually made that's on view, which again, it follows the idea of like the movement of material between one place to another. And so this is 37 uprooted artifacts, and these are objects that are currently in Japan that had come to go there through different circumstances. And so it's just following what the current contemporary circumstance might be that has led them to exist in this specific location. And so now we get to the main character. And so, I made this work, National Treasures, in 2015 because I really wanted to understand how people categorize the national treasures here. And so I was thinking, like, how do people decide what becomes a treasure? Because I think at the time people were like, oh, now like we have immaterial treasures, and I'm like, why is not attached to physics? And so in a sense, the question expanded into the existing treasures. And so I was thinking, what is a national treasure when the nation is always moving? And so in a sense, all of the objects that are in this current list predate all of the contemporary circumstances of Korea and all of the histories that have come since they were made, and that really reflects in the way that the catalog exists today. And so at the time I didn't have the capability of making a drawing that size, and so I made this list just to understand. So I think that you can't really see, but in the bottom there's some gaps because things get demoted at some point. And so that was interesting to me, where again with those like those drawings that were therapy session ones, it could be like similar to this idea where there was a object that was a national treasure at some point and it gets demoted and now it's just a regular treasure. And so I was thinking about like, how do those decisions get made, no? And so this is the work that now we see in the gallery, that while drawing it, because I wanted to again understand the nuance of those things, because I'm not a scholar, and so in a sense I was thinking like, well, all I have is drawing tools, and a lot of time to be able to somehow, if I make the works, I might be able to understand something about it that I don't know. And so really, it's just the way that the way it's constructed is, you know, South Korean treasure number 1, North Korean number 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4 onward. Like it goes all the way across the top and then it restarts like second line, because I thought it could also be installed as a room and then it could just make like a spiral, no? And so while drawing it, you know, you can see like, of course, the obvious like gaps of things that get demoted, taken out. And actually even yesterday when I showed it, there was a person who was like, actually, this lady was a national treasure, but now is not a national treasure anymore. And so even while I was making the drawing, actually South Korea also removed all of the numbers at the beginning of the year to remove the hierarchy that it created. So again, this is not a work that is to be seen as a record of the national treasures itself, but a question about the catalog and how it moved. So because there's more South Korean national treasures, North Korea stops right here, and then there's every other one. That's why the bottom is more sparse, because there's every other one at that point. And so, you know, many of the things that I actually saw before I knew why it was like that, it was that, for example, the tops is all architecture, and then there's movable objects below, and then there's documents at the bottom. And so through the time changes down, you can see the different collecting styles or something. And so actually while I was reading, Gina, who's amazing curator, sent me lots of information to understand. And so there was you know, the top row, which I didn't know before, was all 116 works were actually assigned as a national treasure by the Japanese during the occupation. And so the man who was in charge of the expedition was an architect. And so that's why the top rows is mostly architecture. And then 117 onward got assigned in the 60s. So it was like generations later, and then you can really see a shift in what became a treasure. And so I also was really interested in the like you know, movable objects and immovable objects, because, you know, architecture you can't move, but then the bottom ones, they're movable, so then they're not attached to a specific geography like the buildings are. But again, I think that there's many other things that we can get from the catalog. I think that there are lots of typos and that I made because I actually had a difficult time finding the pictures for the North Korean national treasures. And in a way, by looking at how they begin consistently at the top, and if you keep going down and down, the way that they are documented actually changes too. So like towards the end, there's these like North Korean really landscapey type of documentation. So it's like fields of grass, and somewhere in there there's a treasure, whereas the South Korean ones are very concise objects. And so even in the way that they get documented is different. Can I show the lady? Where's the lady? Ah, there it is. This one, which was one of my favorites. Now regular treasure. I'm like, oh, come on, but so good. And so, yes. What else? And so for this exhibition also, it was really great to be able to show some of the, existing works together, because when we see them in exhibitions alone, it's hard to understand the metadata or whatever that's happening around it. Okay. One of my other interests is, of course, display, and how sometimes the display upstages the actual work. I think that this is one of my favorite pictures, that it's a Santa Maria de la Novella conservation. So this fresco was actually painted over this, and conservator separated it, and so now it's actually displayed like this to show both levels. And I was like, wow, the structure is actually more interesting than the painting itself. And so in a way, it's thinking about how the historical record gets presented to a public, because the function of this was probably as a religious site that now has become more about the field of conservation and the technology available. They both exist together, but it's again a taxonomy issue. Here's like a you can see. So I actually collect a lot, I see a lot of collections and just like to take pictures of different like amazing display that you remember the composition of the display and I can't remember what the specific object is. And so when I first came to do Leeum, of course, I saw this amazing shadow. And so I was thinking like, wow, this is a whole scene where it actually makes a very theatrical stage where, this is like main character and this is like supporting actress. And so for the show, we made a work based on this, which is just how to recreate just the shadow of that display. Again, it's just to be able to encourage the public to see the rest of the collection and look at the beautiful shadow works that are made behind it. And so, but then the great thing about having the display here was also thinking about the contemporary condition in which some of the artifacts here exist. And I wanted to, one of my conservation interests is how these fragments get preserved contemporarily. So, for example, there's a conservator that has put all of these fabric fragments together in this composition. So in the process of conservation, there are formal decisions that might not be directly made, but still get made. And so we can see this beautiful like display. It's not, it's for conservation, but they make these new compositions. And so I've actually made these drawings that are based on the way that the fragments are displayed. So it's like 4 fragments that have been sewn into a fabric, and then this is one version of how that pattern repeats. This is another Coptic fragments of the Met, and so this one repeats as a potential original pattern based on this formal composition. This is my dog for scale. And here is one from the Fowler Museum that was, 20 textile fragments that somebody sewed into this mesh. And so now they're in this singular fabric, the potential reconstruction. And so here, when I was looking, I was like, wow, there's this amazing Avatamsaka Sutra that they have in the first floor. So there's 2 scrolls that exist, but one was really damaged and was actually conserved in the 80s, 89. So this one got conserved in 89, and this one, the top one, because it was better preserved, stayed the same. And so now this work that had a singular function now onward is existing in 2 different types of objects. So here we can see on the first floor the conserved one, which is this bottom one, is amazing. And then this is the better one, the one that was more preserved, but it exists like this. So I was actually thinking how these, of course I understand the impulse of preserving the damaged one, and I also understand the impulse of keeping the information of the material of the other one, because we want to know how, the historical material was made, and a lot of that information actually gets lost through the process of conservation. But then now, because of trying to keep all of these things and information together, now they exist in 2 completely different ways, And so I thought that was a good place to stop. But and so in the installation, we actually have the box of one of these, and then you can see first floor. Thank you.
작가님께 여쭤보고 싶은 게 굉장히 많은데요. 일단 제일 처음 물어보고 싶은 것은 작가님의 작업을 한 2015년 정도부터 좀 초기작부터 보면은 어떤 문화유산에 대한 관심이 계속 있어 왔어요. 헤리티지에 대한 관심. 그래서 그것이 이제 라틴 아메리카의 헤리티지이기도 하고, 지금 전시되어 있는 작업 같은 경우에는 한국의 문화유산이기도 하고, 그렇죠. 그래서 이런 헤리티지의 어떤 면들이 관심을 끌었는지, 그리고 헤리티지가 본인에게 어떤 의미가 있는지 좀 들어보고 싶습니다.
I think that everybody has their own personal connection to heritage, and in a sense, what is interesting to me is how states determine what is the heritage border, because I think that, you can get as small as you want as your local city, history, or, the state history or the continent history, or so many of the different types. And so I think that my interest is mainly how versions of heritage that are collective get sort of defined, or how maybe those, is the impulse of trying to understand a past which we really don't have access to because none of us were alive then. And so all that we have is just sort of the historical record that has passed hands through so many people. And so I think that to keep a connection to something human or something in a way really reflects more on what type of individual heritage, what heritage might mean to each specific person individually.
네, 여기서 약간 조금 더 연결되는 지점인 것 같은데요. 역사에도 굉장히 방금 말씀하셨듯이 여러 사람들이 그 역사를 살아왔고 우리가 지금 가지고 있는 그 역사적인 유물이나 글 같은 것들이 되게 여러 개의 버전일 수 있는 거잖아요. 어떤 하나의 사건이 있지만 그것에 여러 개의 해석이 있을 수 있고 또 하나의 물건에도 여러 개의 목적이 있을 수 있고 이런 식으로 이렇게 1대1로 연결되지 않는 부분들이 많이 있는데 그런 어떤 가능성이라든지 아니면 불확실성 이런 것들이 작업에서 되게 많이 대두가 되는 것 같아요. 그래서 작가님의 작업은 그런 어떤 틈이라고 해야 할까요? 여러 가지 가능성이 공존할 수 있는 어떤 틈에 대한 작업이 많이 있는 것 같은데 그런 부분들이 어떤 면에서 본인의 관심을 끌었는지 좀 궁금합니다.
I think that in a sense is not so much gaps, but they're like layers on top. And so I think that, all of those layers, I think of them as like historical patina, where it's like different interpretations of conservators throughout time or historians throughout time or registrars throughout time adds a new layer of information that when the public experiences the current version of what that is, feels very flat. And so in a sense, is thinking like if we experience objects, historical objects from a singular contemporary historical way, what is all of the other things that we have deleted or overlooked that might actually be important to whatever our relationship with that object might have been. So I'm thinking about gaps as like a literal shape. And so I'm thinking instead of gaps is layers and understanding that they coexist whether we want to see them or not. And so in the teaching of history, how to allow for a compromise of multiple histories to exist at the same time and not just have a singular form of understanding that historical material.
그러면 그렇게 여러 개의 층위라고 말씀을 하셨는데 그 중에서 이런 부분이 조금 더 중요하다라고 판단할 수 있는 게 있을까요? 아니면 모든 것이 다 공평한 그런 스테터스라고 생각하시는지?
I think that the layers exist equally, but I think that the way that we organize them to contemporarily really reflects more about the motivations of whoever is organizing them. And so I think, the historical object is adding multiple layers on top of each other. And so, but the way that they're reorganized to some degree defines which door are we going to see first. And so I think that the question becomes about like expertise, where we believe that like someone who holds knowledge will present this specific layer as the main layer, when, if for example, you talk to a piece of mold, they might actually tell you a different organizational level. It's almost beyond human as well, because, in the end, all of the historical things are just material that has been sorted and reorganized depending on who is organizing at what time.
연결해서 여쭤보고 싶은 게 작업을 보면 인간 중심적이지 않은 시점에서 바라보는 그런 작업들이 여러 개 있어요. 예를 들면 영혼의 시점에서 본다던가 아니면 자연의 시점에서 본다던가 이런 식으로 인간 중심적인 시점을 벗어난 시점이 많이 보이는데 이걸 통해서 이제 우리가 인간 중심적인 시점으로 이것들을 보고 있었구나라는 것을 깨달을 수 있는 계기가 되기도 하는데요. 그런 인간 중심적이지 않은 다른 시점들을 이렇게 조명하는 것의 의미가 무엇이 있을까요?
It's not that all objects are very similar. I think that I like to focus on like who was the actual audience of that material when it was first made. And so, for example, a lot of the objects that I'm interested in is, historical materials that are made for like spiritual beings or something that is already made for an audience that is not human. And so in a sense, it's like, what does it mean for us as people now to be looking and defining something that is actually not made for us? In a sense, it's thinking many of the things that we actually excavated were actually on its way to becoming dirt again, like getting decayed, etc. But now they're suspended in this like institution through different conservation methods. And so, but in a way, even the most advanced conservation lab cannot keep the material from actually going in its decay. And so in a sense, it's just controlling how fast it decays by slowing it down a lot. But what I actually think is that we want to understand these materials in relationship to our own life's timeline. And so like, okay, 100 years of its life, I want this to exist, be well preserved during this time. But in a sense, if you start thinking about history in the object's timeline, which is infinitely bigger, then its current situation in a museum or a collection is actually very short. And so it was actually it wasn't living as a historical object for even longer than it has existed in an institution. And we think that the institution is also going to be around forever, when in the future we have no idea how those materials might live on. Maybe they'll be like paperweight, which I actually have seen, things that get deaccessioned that were like very special, and then someone realizes it's a fake, and then it becomes a office paperweight. And so it's just which time frame do we look at it?
처음에 이 유물들이 만들어졌을 당시의 목적과 맥락에 대해서 이야기를 하셨는데, 그러면 지금 우리는 예를 들어서 옛날에 물을 따르는 주전자였다든지, 아니면 간장을 담는 종지였다든지, 아니면 찻잔이었다든지, 그런 목적으로 만들어진 것들을 이제 저희는 다 마른 상태로 디스플레이를 해서 이제 전시를 하잖아요. 그러면은 이제 그런 것들을, 그런데 실제로 걔네가 만들어진 목적에 맞게 저희가 디스플레이를 한다면, 예를 들어서 차를 담아서 전시를 한다든지 이런 식으로 했을 때 그것이 이 물리적인 보존이랑 상충되는 면이 있잖아요. 그렇게 했을 때 좀 더 빨리 손상이 될 수도 있고, 그런 식의 두 가지가 부딪히는데, 그럴 때 이제 어떤 식으로 타협을 해야 한다고 생각하세요? 해야 한다기보다는 어떤 제안을 하고 싶으신지 궁금합니다.
I think that it's not all objects exist similarly in the museum, and so again, my main interest is the ones that were supposed to do a function infinitely. So someone in the past thought that it was going to be soy sauce bowl forever, and so many people do actually take those ceramics to their afterlife thinking, I'm going to use it then. And so what does it mean when now it's in a display and they're like, oh, I wish I could have soy sauce in the future, but now you took it and now it's on display. And so in a sense, it's not every bowl, it's just the ones that someone in the past wanted to use forever, which includes today. And so I think that with those specific objects, it's not that it's like one way or another, but somehow can we have a compromise, because right now material and conservation and registration methods definitely prioritize the material conservation of something, but maybe we can start thinking about its spiritual life as a material as well. Like, how do we preserve the spiritual material that this object actually exists in? I want to tell a side story, but maybe it'll be good. So I went to this conservation lab in Italy that had, just to see, I visit lots of conservation. And then in this one room, they had a woman who was a wood expert. And she had Catholic, what are those called, sculptures in there that needed to be conserved. She had like Buddha things that were wood that were meant to be conserved. She had like Egyptian mummies in wood that need to be conserved. And so she was like, but she had no idea about each one of the religious functions of each one of those materials that are also supposed to be embedded in the actual object, because she's a wood expert, and so in a sense is thinking about like, of course the formal parts of the material will be well preserved, but if she doesn't know the functions or specific ways that it has to be treated in a specific way, it actually could get damaged in the process of not taking into account some of those original functions which could still be influential for someone's future afterlife, etc.
지금 전시에 나와 있는 작업에 대해서 좀 얘기를 하고 싶은데요. 이번에 이제 설치 작업이 하나 있고, 그 다음에 그 4개의 패널인 드로잉 하나랑, 그 다음에 1개 패널짜리 드로잉, 이렇게 3개의 작품이 나왔는데요. 그 중에서 이 평면 작업들은 꼭 페인팅이라고 하지 않고 드로잉이라고 꼭 부르시는데, 그게 색연필로 사용을 하시긴 했지만 배경은 전부 아크릴 물감으로 되어 있잖아요. 그래서 어떻게 보면 페인팅이라고 불러도 무리가 없을 것 같은 재료인데, 드로잉이라는 이름을 고집하시는 이유에 대해서 듣고 싶습니다.
I think, painting is so attached to like capital A art that it has its own categories. It's again a taxonomy question where, drawing exists in multiple other fields. And so in a sense, it feels more natural to think of, the medium as inclusive of other methodologies as well. And so what I also like about the drawing is that everybody's also doing a drawing. And so like every time you write something is essentially a drawing itself. And so I want to believe is that if you anyone who can spend enough energy making this work would be able to learn similar things as I have made, because the drawing is, I feel like it's already existing in your house, so it's a shorter step than making a painting.
이런 드로잉 작업을 하실 때 보면은 어떤 유물에 대한 사진을 보고 작업을 주로 하셨는데요. 이번 국보 같은 경우에는. 근데 그럴 때 하나의 유물이 여러 개의 사진이 있을 때가 있잖아요. 그게 이제 뭐 정면, 측면, 바닥면 뭐 이런 경우일 수도 있고, 아니면 어떤 유적지의 경우에는 뭐 원경, 근경, 아니면 어떤 한 건물 이럴 수도 있고, 여러 개 버전의 사진이 존재를 할 텐데, 그 중에서 어떤 것을 골라서 그리셨는지 그 판단 기준이 궁금합니다.
I think that is it's a practical choice, because when I'm making the drawings, they do come from photos. So when you see them individually, they're photographed all at different angles. And so when I actually draw them, the shelf is the last part. But before the shelf is drawn, it's really disorienting, because you don't actually know where the floor is, since the floor is like in every picture changes. And so I think that the way that I have chosen multiple pictures is different reasons, but like, will it fit the picture plane better, or will it be like too difficult to see? But I also think that, at least for the national there was very few instances, at least in the North Korean pictures, where there was multiple pictures. But I liked, there was one instance where there was a kiln building, right? And so there was a picture of the kiln, and there was a picture of the site as a field. And I chose the field one because I also think that it's not necessarily that, again, this is not a scholarly drawing, but it's also just to understand that somewhere in there is a treasure. And so I think that in a way, I was like, maybe there's already so many specific ones to focus attention on, but to actually have the public not actually need to understand every single detail of individual ones, but also just know that it's just the idea of a treasure, instead of actually being like, I can recognize it.
사진을 고르고 그 다음에 색연필로 전부 다 그리는 과정에서 하나하나의 유물들이랑 굉장히 많은 시간을 보내게 되실 텐데 그렇게 유물과 1대1로 시간을 보내면서 어떤 것들을 유물에 대해서 또는 뭐 다른 것들에 대해서 배우게 되는지 궁금합니다.
I think that I make the drawings also because I'm a very lazy person, and so I'm like, okay, I need to make a lot of time actually really paying attention to this individual works. And so hopefully during the time it takes to render it, I will have thought about it and given it enough time to understand some of it. And I actually, during COVID, I actually started working with some assistants. So we work together. I have two assistants, one who is actually Italian, and he, after helping me work with this, really knows every single national treasure as well. And so I was thinking through the process of drawing, because it's so long, he actually was like, oh, I recognize so many different patterns as well, just from the time it takes. He was like, I think that these documents at the bottom, he wanted to know if like the Chinese character was correct, because he had been staring at those characters for so long, and we don't know how to write in ancient Chinese either. But I think that taking the time, you really understand different strokes or different compositions of things that you wouldn't just by like reading about it or like seeing the picture itself.
국보 작업에 대해서 좀 더 여쭤보고 싶은데요. 이렇게 남한과 북한이라는 두 나라의 문화유산에 대해서 특별히 관심을 가지게 된 계기나 이유가 있을까요?
I was actually thinking of it as like a giant clump of material. And so I was thinking most of these historical objects were all predated all of the separation, etc. And so I wanted to really understand, through how the catalog has changed, you can really learn about contemporary Korean history as well, both at the same time, where it's like, oh, well, there are many of the buildings from the rendering, you can really see the similarities and everything. But now that they exist in two different categories, how do these categories, have these new contemporary categories changed the way that we understand a material that was actually so similar in the beginning, no? Or can we, we have access to how, different generations of committees have made decisions about what becomes a treasure, in the 60s onward, depending. And so I was actually like, I want to know how they're deciding in North Korea what were the treasures then, and if additional treasures keep getting assigned, will they have different tastes now that is different? And how through time, it's like, are they? And so it's not the questions that I can answer, but more like really, I wanted to throw energy at it just to see if somehow through it, to be able to understand and really learn about contemporary Korea.
네, 그러면 제가 마지막으로 여쭤보고 싶은 것은 이전 작업에 보시면 이제 기관이랑 또는 기관의 소장품을 가지고 작업을 하셨을 경우에 그 기관에게 어떤 제안을 하신 경우들도 있었잖아요. 그런데 이번에 리움 전시에서는 특별히 제안을 하시지는 않았어요. 근데 만약에 리움 또는 남북한의 문화부라든지 그런 어떤 기관에 제안을 하고 싶은 것이 있다면 어떤 게 있는지 궁금합니다.
When there's an institution that holds historical material that also has this ongoing forever function, I think in a way I'd like to think that, of course, when the object becomes accessioned, it becomes part of a historical collection. But then I'd like to think that by having that material in the collection, it turns the collection into a different type of container as well. And so, for example, with collections that have bodies in the collection, of course that body is historical and because it's in a collection, but it also turns the museum that is into a cemetery. And so, because that's the building that is supposed to go around this material. And so I think that the relationship between a collection and its container is mutual. And so I think that in a way I'd like to encourage the museum to see in the collection and see maybe there are some things that are supposed to be double things, and so in a sense the conservator might become a coroner as well, and then the museum itself can become a cemetery as well as a historical site, etc., and how to accommodate for a conservation of historical material that is not just purely prioritizing the formal physical object.
네, 감사합니다.